We're going to go now to John Stockwell from his home in Elgin, Texas. John Stockwell is former top-ranking CIA officer. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Well, as you pointed out, it is a new world order. What is the shape and contour of that new world order as you see it?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think you know I've got a book coming out, South End Press, titled The Praetorian Guard, the U.S. Role in the New World Order. Some very significant things have happened in the world since I last spoke up in Colorado. I'm sitting down here in Texas right now as the map is configured. It's become clear that the U.S. and the USSR were effectively one broken and the other one set back substantially economically by the Cold War, which is now officially over. The U.S., because of this massive overspending on the military, is no longer in control of its economic future, this $4.5 trillion debt. The Soviet Union in much worse shape, but the interesting thing is that the New World Order, of course, the world financial order, of which Mr. Bush and family are very definitely strong members and deeply committed to, they control world finance and of course, the U.S. economy. But the U.S. is still the military superpower, and this creates the situation where we're right up front become the world's cops. We were in a sense before, but now more so and more clearly. The Persian Gulf War, of course, which I'm following. Did you know, by the way, that I predicted a year ago, actually 15 months ago in public presentations, that George Bush would be shopping for a war about now?
No. What informed that prediction?
Well, it was not a shot in the dark. 9 months before the invasion of Panama, I had predicted that he would invade Panama if he couldn't oust Noriega in a coup d'etat. This is, my 13-year study of the U.S. marches to war and secret wars, overt wars, and the dynamics and why we do these things and when we do them. And so it was my analysis and prediction, and of course it turned out to be a right on. I was not sure the war would be in the Persian Gulf. Reagan pulled back from getting involved in the Iran-Iraqi war because, despite what he would consider provocations, because the logistics are so bad and the dynamics of the Middle East, complexities of politics there, may not work in the U.S. interest. I don't believe they will in the long term, but this Praetorian Guard concept of the U.S., we're obviously not fighting for cheaper oil. In fact, they've jimmied the oil prices, kicked them up at the pumps, and you and I are still paying higher prices for oil, for gasoline than we were in July, for example, of last year. The middlemen, of course, ripping off the difference. The world prices didn't determine that. The middlemen, the Texas oil men, of whom Mr. Bush is a ranking member. But this oil, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the oil we're actually allegedly fighting for over there, massive stores, it's not U.S. oil. We don't own it, and we don't buy it. The Saudis and Kuwaitis own it, and the Japanese and Germans buy most of it, and the Japanese right up front. Newsweek has had an article on this 2 weeks ago, or two issues ago, noting the Japanese are not supporting us heavily in this war because they're not concerned. Saddam Hussein will sell them the oil just like the Kuwaitis would, and might be even actually easier to deal with instead of harder. Who knows? His country has grievous economic problems, and the Kuwaitis are sitting quite fat for a number of years now. And so the Japanese have felt no urgency whatsoever to go to war, and they're concerned at the damage the war could do to the oil fields and to the production, the environment in terms of the production of oil. I'm not sure they're world champions of environmental problems. So we're fighting a war for other people's interests, but also obviously for Mr. Bush's political interests. Our economy, our nation, with grievous problems, now effectively bankrupted, and pillars of the community, major organs, establishment organs, are acknowledging what you and I were saying in the mid-'80s, this overspending on the military, not on trade goods, rendering the U.S. non-competitive, putting us in a position where we're plunging deep in debt, deep in hock. That debt won't go away, and and of course the slashing of social services, the dropping of the U.S. standard of living, the deficits continuing apace. These are problems that Mr. Bush helped to create. We were the world's creditor nation, the richest country in the 70s. He and Mr. Reagan bankrupted it. He's the president now. He desperately has to distract the nation from these problems that he has very much helped to create, and the traditional solution is to take us to war. Now, fascinating thing about this war is that they promised us, they being Mr. Reagan, Mr. Bush to a lesser sense in the 80s, and especially the military establishment, they promised us since the Vietnam War that we would have another war in which we would erase the Vietnam syndrome, that we would sooner or later have to demonstrate to the world that we knew how to organize, mobilize ourselves to fight a good, clean war. And of course, in his interest, the military establishment's interest, Mr. Bush is getting gold stars all over the place for his orchestration of this war. They picked an enemy very carefully. Saddam Hussein is easily painted into the role of a great antichrist, Hitler, a vicious, evil person who's done evil things. And we now have the details coming out solidly documented. I refer you to Ralph Schoenman's article about how the U.S. lured Saddam Hussein in Iraq into invading Kuwait and provoked him. We reassured him that we had no defense agreement. The ambassador, when he called her in to talk, she said, the Secretary of State has told me to emphasize that we have no defense agreement with Kuwait. And so he invaded Kuwait thinking he was on safe ground. This doesn't make him a saint by any means. Quite the contrary. I'm not fond of this man at all.
So, John, you're suggesting that the United States, the Bush administration, lured or seduced Saddam Hussein into invading Kuwait?
Oh, this is not, this is solider. At the time the Vietnam War kicked off, the Tonkin resolution, the detractors, the people in the peace community, or the more conservative with a small c people, were saying something's wrong here. It turned out history eventually proved that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was never happened as it was presented, and it was provoked literally by CIA raids on attack, nasty craft they called them, at dawn. In this case, in this war, we have the provocation quite detailed already. This is not some paranoid speculation of people to the left. One, the CIA was working with the Kuwaitis. Ramsey Clark has brought out some information about this, working with the Kuwaitis to destabilize Iraq and to provoke them. There was the Rumaila oil fields, which Kuwait seized and moved to tap into. There was the manipulation of world oil prices at a time when Iraq was broke and had a big debt to pay. There was even before that the U.S. encouraging Iraq to attack Iran back in the 70s in the Iran-Iraqi war. This it adds up to a well-documented program by the U.S. working with the Kuwaitis to provoke Saddam Hussein into invading Kuwait. And I, having predicted that the U.S. would be shopping for a war, if they had listened to my lectures, they wouldn't have done it, or at least they would have known what they were getting into, because I was definitely assuring the world that Mr. Bush needed a war. They spent the 80s getting everything ready. Now, in terms of this Vietnam syndrome and his gold stars and his interests, his view of the world, his world order, not mine, certainly, he's got 85% of this nation supporting the war, or at least supporting the troops that are over there. The peace community, has a tremendous energy of feeling of distress about the war, but not wanting to become angry, yearning for a better feeling about it, and wearing these yellow ribbons of we support the troops, we don't support the war, bring the troops back, but we support the troops. And then, of course, I've been, of course, to the demonstrations and rallies and lectures like everyone else and listening carefully. The word in the peace community that seems to be coming out continuously is that the peace community has to avoid, quote, avoid the mistakes of the Vietnam War, avoid castigating the soldiers themselves. That was allegedly a mistake of the Vietnam War. I sit back and wonder, would the people of this country have succeeded in stopping the Vietnam War eventually if they had been sending messages of love to the people on the ground who were doing the killing? In the Vietnam War, the soldiers there were drafted. They didn't have a choice. In this war, it's a volunteer army. Everybody over there volunteered to join the military. Not one single one of them was drafted. And if we had not had Chicago in '68 and Kent State and Berkeley and the massive angry energy in the peace community, I reread the Graham and Gurr book, The History of Violence in America, in which they conclude that there has never been substantial social change, revolutionary change in the U.S. without violence or at least the serious threat of boycotting and disruption. People have to stand up and draw a line and project their disapproval. But again, George Bush has succeeded as they have sort of worn the nation down with their orchestrations and with appeals to greatness and standing tall and self-righteousness. He's got 85% of the people, as the polls show, supporting what he's doing, or at least supporting the troops. Some of them saying, well, I don't like the war, there were other options, but we have to stop Saddam Hussein. And again, the peace community supporting the soldiers who are over there by their own volition doing these very violent things.
What's your assessment of the media coverage of the Iraq War?
I had great hopes in the fall that this war would be stopped, despite Bush's need for it and his efforts to orchestrate, eventually successfully, because there was a big schism in the military against it. The military is often more reluctant than the politicians to actually go to war. President Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz were arguing publicly for an invasion of Nicaragua in the mid-'80s, and it was the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs, and Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, who said, not with our Defense Department, you don't, unless it's a popular war. See, the military wants the perks. They want the money to flow. If the money's flowing, they don't want to risk that with all the trauma of war in the body bags. They're more cautious about actually plunging into war with all its horrors than the politician. Not always, but often. And we saw the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Commander of the Forces, General Schwarzkopf, over there in the Persian Gulf area. Senior admirals, 2 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs, testifying to the Congress that we should not plunge into this thing. We should wait a year or 2 to see what the sanctions could do and how it could be worked out. And I was hoping this energy from the military would actually stop the thing, because in the establishment, with the power and influence of the military, since there's solid arguments against it, we saw the media giving much better and more balanced coverage of this war than we had, for example, of the Contra program in Nicaragua, which almost brought us into war, and the Vietnam War and other military, Panama, for example, other military activities we've undertaken where the press generally, the major media press generally, flowed smoothly along. This one was debated. Pros and cons were published daily in the papers and CNN. And during the first hours and days of the war, the Persian Gulf War itself, lots of mention of demonstrations and the controversy in the U.S. Again, I'm not sure they would have done this if there had not been a deep rift in the establishment itself about whether or not this thing is wise. Now, in terms of the detail of the combat, of what's happening over there, of course, we have massive manipulation by the Pentagon, by the defense, as they promised to do back in the Vietnam War. Several, Dean Rusk, others said that the next war could not be fought candidly in front of the TV cameras. You can't have, they say, generals in the field making decisions with the TV cameras hanging right over their shoulders. You remember, during the invasion of Grenada, the press was sealed out of the island, and all they were able to show to the nation were what the Army Psy-War people had developed on videos and given to them. Afterwards, General Seidel headed a commission meeting with the leaders of the media, and an agreement was reached that they would form a press pool that would cover future wars. And of course, they were quite aware of the fact that we would have future wars. Not any possibility in their minds that we would not have future wars and actions and invasions and things. So now, in the Persian Gulf, we see the Seidel Commission principles working with a press pool. Only the military can really get into Iraq. They're releasing to us fascinating clippings of successful missile firings with the TV cameras in the nose of the missiles, so we can see them going right into the building, and then the second one going right into the exact same place. And this is very moving. Nintendo games really working in real life. They're not showing us the missiles that are going into civilian housing areas and missing, and the planes that are crashing into each other and falling down. All wars are chaotic, this one as much as any other. It's fascinating to note that they are right now, in the last 2 days, paying a grievous price for this, because they oversold in the first hours and days with the fun of using finally this new equipment and actually firing these missiles and bombing people with their testosterone pumping massively. They were walking tall and crowing a lot and showing all the successes, and it didn't work. There were 2,000 raids the first day, and then 4,000, and suddenly it's 10,000 sorties already. And they were telling us after the second day that they had taken out the Iraqi air and missiles, and they just couldn't. They were jumping up and down in their excitement with their success. And then these Scuds keep on coming in, and they find out they've only knocked out 18 of Iraq's 600-odd aircraft, and the Secretary of Defense had to admit that they had miscalculated. Apparently Iraq has hundreds of Scud missiles in hardened silos that they can't get to. Some of them they can't even get to them with nuclear weapons if they used them. And then, of course, they're right now agonizing about the reality, which they had discounted, of what if Saddam Hussein blows the oil fields in Kuwait? What price will that do to the availability of this oil? Can the fields be permanently damaged? I don't know, perhaps not, but they can certainly be burned. The massive smoke that's going into the air right now, which affects tactics and strategy, but also the environment. They've taken a bold move by orchestrating this war, insisting that there not be negotiations, and plunging into it. And now the bills are starting to come in already. They have not succeeded. They have not brushed Iraq aside as easily as they seem to feel they would in the first few days. And the piper's going to be paid. The environmental damage, the damage to the oil, the frustration in the media. If you watch the press conferences in the first few days, the media was caught in the excitement. And now they're beginning to challenge and argue with the military Psy-War people who hold these briefings and give them the tailored information. I think the U.S. has got a big problem on its hand in this war. They may prevail in 2 or 3 months' time. I noticed my old boss, Bill Colby, just before the invasion, or the airstrikes began, saying, of course, we'll take out the Iraqi air and missiles in one afternoon afternoon. It'll be a turkey shoot, he said. And I'm sure he's now looking in the mirror and and regretting that he said that. His memories of World War II and his testosterone affecting his judgment. We have not succeeded with this 10,000 sorties yet. We've killed a lot of people, done a lot of damage, hurt a lot of people. In fact, see, since we're being given such carefully tailored information, we can't be sure that the burning of these refineries in Kuwait are not the result of the massive U.S. bombing. We simply don't know. We know they're not telling us the whole truth. They're not showing us their failures and their mistakes, and they exist in every war that's ever been fought. So we don't know. Probably they're telling the truth about that. Probably the Iraqi forces burned those refineries and oil installations, but we don't know. They could have been set off by massive B-52 strikes that were dropping their bombs through the clouds and missed by 50 miles or so.
John, let's talk a little bit about what you refer to as Psyops, psychological operations, and I'd like you to discuss the notion and practice of disinformation and blowback in the context of two examples, I think, of that has happened since the war broke out. The first being a report that 6 Iraqi helicopters and their crews flew into Saudi Arabia and defected, and that 50 Iraqi tanks and their crews turned themselves over to Egyptian forces in Saudi Arabia. These reports were quoted almost verbatim in the mainstream media as being accurate. They have later been revealed, now revealed as to be totally false as part of the propaganda ploy.
Yeah, you recall in my book, In Search of Enemies, my first book, where I was running the war for the National Security Council in Angola, a secret war, a small thing without U.S. forces up front involved. But we had a kind of a loose cannon operative in the field, and he had tapped into the world media. He'd found a way and was dumping stories into the world media. And he published a report without clearing it with headquarters of Soviet advisors, 40 of them, being captured in a battle near Malanje. And this is very dramatic, provocative information. I mean, if Russians had been captured in an African bush war, that would be very important. You know, what would the Russians do? Would they put in their armies? So the world media descended on the place and checked it out, and Jonas Savimbi said, "What battle? We're not even near Malanje, and I don't think there are any Russians in Angola. At least I haven't heard of any." And this put fierce pressure on the CIA, on us, on my offices, and especially on that guy in the field, for publishing a clumsy story that could be proven or disproven. And I see this thing about the alleged Iraqi helicopter defection and the tanks, which the military eventually admitted did not seem to have happened. This clearly was some Psy-war people getting carried away and dumping a story out there, and it wasn't true, and it embarrassed the chief, the Pentagon. The White House finessed it and just refused to address it, duck the issue. But the Psy-war people are out there, as they are traditionally, and even in peace, but especially in a hot one like this, pumping out stories, trying at every point to cast Saddam Hussein as, the epitome of evil, and Iraq. I mean, we have a situation, now mind you, I regret very much the U.S. has gone into this war. I wish we had not. I wish we would get out of it and find another solution. I think it's a disaster. This does not put me in a position of vindicating or trying to or even wanting to vindicate Saddam Hussein. But we've run 10,000 sorties over Iraq, bombing and strafing and rocketing, and that, we're very righteous about that. When they fire missiles at Israel, that's pure terrorism, and that's the way it's being presented to us on the TV continuously. I doubt if the people on the ground in Iraq, in Baghdad, across Iraq, who are dead or dying or having their loved ones killed, see the distinction. Now, at the same time, in fairness and balance, I notice an interesting difference in Saddam Hussein's, in the Iraqi conduct. They claimed historic rights to Kuwait. It was formally part of Iraq. It was separated from Iraq by the colonial powers. They claim a right to it, and that's part of their justification for going back in. And with the provocation, with the U.S. encouraging them, or giving them, as Lee Hamilton in the Congress said, giving them a green light to go in, you could, a temptation to be sympathetic for their going in to recapture, to liberate their lost province, you come to a screeching halt in any sympathy you might have because of their conduct inside Kuwait. It clearly was, as was massively documented, rape and pillage and destruction. If you compare that, for example, with the Vietnam War, where I was in Saigon and fled on the helicopters at the end, or fled with the helicopters at the end. I actually went out on the last Pan Am flight right at the end. If you compare the NVA Army's conduct as they liberated the South and Saigon, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army soldiers, set up their tents in the little parks and the lanes between boulevards and ate rice and water chestnuts for months as they had out in the swamps, while the South Vietnamese people around them had chicken and fish and beef and went about their lives. And you had to respect their sincerity in claiming this was a liberation. They were not punishing the people that they had eventually or effectively conquered. They had beaten the South Vietnamese army, but they did not punish the people. They were very careful not to punish the people. Then they launched their program, of course, of purging, of taking away quietly into their reindoctrination centers, as they call them prisons, if you will. But it was a rational process, picking out the people who had been leaders, they felt, or could be leaders of resistance. What Saddam Hussein's forces did in Kuwait, you just can't be sympathetic for their claims of liberating their area and province.
John, you served in the CIA in Indochina as well as in Angola. You've seen wars, and you've seen the strange, bizarre bedfellows that wars make. What do you make of this alliance of the United States and Syria, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia? What's your assessment of that?
Well, I'm less enthusiastic for the caliber of our bedfellows, as you put it, than Mr. Bush is. Of course, this is the greatest ego trip for any politician in modern times, since I don't know when, of being able to publicize and take credit for bringing together a world order in the direction of world government, in the direction of like the Roman Empire, except not conquering it, but nevertheless bringing it together, and bringing together a coalition of Arab states along with Israel to support what we're doing, and finally getting U.S. forces installed in Saudi Arabia, where doubtless they will remain for eternity. To begin with, we make such an issue of the horror, the unprovoked attack by the Iraqis on Kuwait. Well, it may have been, in a sense, provoked, actually, but painting Saddam Hussein as evil, is he in fact any more evil than our allies now in Syria? I would argue not. In fact, he's been less involved in terrorist activities against U.S. people and taking of hostages and whatnot. Syria put its forces into Lebanon and took over the direction of that country. Israel put its forces into Lebanon. I mean, countries have been sending their armies across borders in recent times in various parts of the world without us becoming upset. The people, the leaders, now I want to clearly distinguish between the people in Saudi Arabia and the people in Kuwait. but the governments, the people that we're actually supporting there, these governments make no pretense of democracy. Supposedly, we invaded Panama to restore democracy there. These people don't pretend democracy, and certainly they're not liberated. They don't represent at least my values, my human values. I don't know about the rest of the world, but their repression of women. They execute women for adultery. I just cannot sympathize with that, or support it, or sympathize with a program. They're venal. They're corrupt. They have tons and tons, billions of dollars from their control of the oil in their countries. I don't believe, frankly, that one person from this country should go over and die to protect these people, and again, I'm referring to a handful of people in each country, to protect their gluttonous oil interests. This is the way I feel about it. Obviously, some people disagree. You notice in the paper today, the papers, Egyptians, others fleeing from Iraq, enraged. Before, 2 weeks ago, they were saying, they loathed Saddam Hussein. But now, having been under the U.S. bombs and rockets, and having taken their losses and the trauma of the thing, they're raging against what the U.S. is doing in Iraq to the people of Iraq. Now, this was predictable. This is going to be a tremendous engine of hostile negative energy to the U.S. in the Arab world. I don't think George Bush's coalition is going to have a solid long-term effect unless we move into an extremely repressive, brutal era in the Middle East in which the U.S. and its allies over there are just being extremely ham-handed on their own people and repressing them greatly as resentment against the United States predictably mounts.
We're talking to John Stockwell, former CIA officer, on KGNU in Boulder, Colorado. John is joining us from his home in Elgin, Texas. The number here is 449-4885. If you'd like to talk to John Stockwell, please give us a call. John, I was wondering what you thought of the rather sudden and passionate allegiance that the United States, the Bush administration particularly, has shown toward the United Nations. Does that strike you as ironic?
Since the U.S. has not had the support of the United Nations for the last 20 years, and has, especially Reagan Bush, in the 80s, were threatening to shut the UN down, to cut off its money, putting enormous pressure on it, and it was one of the main planks of the conservative platform with a capital C, was to shut down the UN because it didn't support the U.S. Empire's interests, and never really had. So why should we fund this organization which voted continuously or so often against our interests? Bush saw an opportunity to work through it in bringing together his New World Order in this alliance against Iraq and Saddam Hussein and their invasion of Kuwait. And so suddenly, he loves the UN because he is able effectively to use it right now. I see this as fairly normal and understandable in the cynicism of world politics.
John, we've got a whole line full of calls. Can you stay with us for a while?
How long?
Another 15 minutes?
Yes,
Terrific.
I've got some other calls that I've agreed to make, but let's.
Thanks so much. I know you're really busy.
I used to live in Colorado, and I love the state. I wish I could move up there right now.
Hi, you're on KGNU with John Stockwell.
Hello?
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes. Hi, David. Hi, John. Thank you very much for filling in some of the gaps. My name's Bill. A question that keeps coming up amongst my friends is, would it help to kill Saddam, and do you think we're actually, in reality, targeting him? And I'll take my answer off the air.
Oh, without any question, the U.S. is targeting Saddam Hussein, but they're smart enough, having learned the lessons twice before. In Panama especially, they were, with the media watching closely, they were targeting Noriega. They couldn't find him. And say that they are not targeting Saddam Hussein, but it's because the Pentagon has admitted that he is apparently safe in massive reinforced bunkers underneath his palace that even nuclear weapons wouldn't crack. And the fact that they know this so clearly, indicates that they're thinking about it. Yes, indeed, if Saddam Hussein were killed, it would change the energy and nature and leadership of what's happening over there. I have no idea. I freely admit I have no sense whatsoever of who might replace him and whether they would have the same policies and hang on against the United States in this war, or whether they would capitulate if he was suddenly gone.
Well, John, just to sort of follow up on that, did not the United States attempt to assassinate Muammar Gaddafi of Libya in 1985 in that aerial bombardment?
Yeah, I had said there were two cases where we tried and failed. Yes, they definitely targeted Muammar Gaddafi. They fired rockets at his home where they had intelligence 45 minutes before the raids that he was there. And he had either forewarned or by lucky accident had left, and they killed his 18-year-old daughter instead. And then, having justified their view of a very harsh world where you kill people you don't like, the White House under Ronald Reagan, of course, was not apologetic even for killing his daughter. So they tried twice before, failed to kill world leaders they were targeting, so this time they're careful not to say they're targeting him.
Good morning, you're on KJNU with John Stockwell.
Good morning, David, and good morning, John.
Yes.
Listen, I commend what you gentlemen are doing about keeping the free flow of information in view of the highly managed, stage-managed mainstream media. My question, and also I would like to say that I oppose this war with all my heart. The question I have for you, John, is whether you feel there is any likelihood, given that, according to reports, the United States has nuclear weapons over there with their logistical planning and so forth, whether you feel the United States would covertly employ the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons.
Before this, the violence broke out, back even in September, I was talking to better heads than mine, people like Admiral Carroll at the Center for Defense Information, about that, and asking him exactly that question, and he was saying emphatically not. The U.S. would not use nuclear weapons. We had former Governor, Secretary of the Navy, John Connolly, at one point said, if we're going to do it, we ought to go in and nuke Baghdad and just get it over with. I believe there was an op-ed by Jim Fain, who's been pretty moderate overall and pretty good about revealing the U.S. budgetary and financial problems, suggesting that we should really go in heavy, get this thing over with cleanly, arguing that there would be fewer deaths and less suffering overall if we did that. One of the factors involved here in the use of nuclear weapons, I think, is that the U.S. clearly needed, the Bush administration needed and wanted this war, and steamrolled opposition to get it. I don't think they want it over in the first day. It won't be a sufficient pageant. In fact, a certain amount of struggle will be useful to their purposes to prolong the distraction of the people in this country from the real problems facing this nation.
I agree.
Now, obviously, if it goes on for a long time, then they're going to start looking bad, and it'll backfire upon them. Now, remember, we have conventional bombs that are almost as powerful as nuclear weapons now, so there are other ways to go about it. Now, what Admiral Carroll mentioned to me back in, I think it was in October, possibly late September, I'd have to look at my notes, was his concern was he was sure the U.S. would not initiate the use of nuclear weapons, but he was afraid that Israel might. If Israel started taking some heavy hits, they might retaliate with nuclear weapons. And I was deeply concerned about that. However, in the last few days, as the Scud missiles have been falling in and around Tel Aviv, the Israelis have actually shown a great deal of restraint in retaliating. They have not retaliated, to my knowledge, at all. Well, they're obviously thinking about it and about to, much less going in with nuclear weapons.
Let's go to another call.
Listen, David,
Yeah.
don't cut me off on this because according to reports, unless they're totally unreliable, the United States has 400 nuclear weapons over there at this point. My question, and it has not been answered, is whether or not John or you, David, feel there's any likelihood of the United States covertly using low-yield tactical nuclear weapons. Now, would you please answer that?
Well, I was trying to answer that. I do not think the U.S. will. It could not be covert. It would be known. The use of nuclear weapons, yes, we definitely have several hundred over there. They go with these great battle groups. We certainly have the capability there, a redundancy by hundreds of what we would need to crack Iraq or damage it vastly more than we are now. But it could not be kept secret. It would be too controversial. The word would come out. I've thought about that in terms of provocation, since our Psy-war people and the strategists definitely do things, in war especially, to be blamed on the other side. Might they crack off even a dirty little weapon and make it look like the Iraqis had done it? And again, I think not. I think there's too much controversy over nuclear weapons inside the Pentagon, inside the defense establishment, for them to hope to keep it secret.
Well, John, I hope you're right. Keep up the good work.
Thanks for calling.
All right.
Good morning. You're on KGNU with John Stockwell.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm very gratified to listen to this conversation because Mr. Stockwell is defending a thesis that I've been trying to convince people of for years with far less information than he has. My question is regarding the domestic police state mechanism. I called a couple of days ago and challenged another guest on the authoritarian and powerful nature of the police state mechanism that the Reagan and Bush administrations have been skillfully building up for the last few years. And my question to him was, at what point do we give up on this democracy and acknowledge that it is no longer a democracy and that it's no longer meeting our needs as a people, and replace it with something that does? And he accused me of being a provocateur. Now that indicates a high level of paranoia in the peace community against something that happened during the Vietnam War, and that was a high degree of provocateurism by the FBI and other interested parties in the peace movement, trying to get the agenda to be too radical to be tenable, and also just distribution of LSD and all kinds of other things. My question to Mr. Stockwell is, in his expert opinion, realizing that he's not an FBI veteran but CIA instead, nonetheless, in your opinion, what danger do you believe peace activists are in? I mean, when do the quiet knocks on the door in America start happening, and when do people start disappearing?
Well, this was another thing that I had talked about a year ago in terms of their, and before that in terms of the establishment, the Bush White House. During the 80s, their objectives in this war, during the 80s, they were laying on the FEMA program, the actual infrastructure for cracking down on people in this country. I see the brush going back and forth across the U.S., each time leaving behind another layer, painting on restrictions and anti-democratic controls on this society. So far, they're doing it in such a way that they're effectively selling it to the American people. I'll give you two quick examples because we're obviously running low on time. One, the great drug war that has mobilized the nation quite successfully. The figures are now coming out, and there is so much sham in this war that conservative columnist William F. Buckley is joining Anthony Lewis and others in condemning this thing. For example, in 1985, we have the figures, the DEA and EPA figures and the U.S. Bureau of Mortality. They estimate 3,562 people died as a direct use of drugs, of controlled substances. That's 100, less than 100, the number of people that died from tobacco and alcohol use. It's half the number of people who died from overdosing on prescription drugs. 3,500 compared with about 40,000 that died from passive cigarette smoke. And yet they have used this drug war successfully to just obliterate almost a massive attack on the Bill of Rights. The old innocent until proven guilty and your right to trial by a jury of your peers and all of that is now effectively history. They can work up a paper on you, DEA officers, describing you as a drug dealer, and on the basis of that paper, they can take away your house, car, impound your bank account so that you can't hire attorneys to defend you without indicting you, much less trying you and convicting you. Now, a second example of this brush passing over and each time leaving behind less freedom and less democracy. I was traveling in the early days on a lecture tour. I'm home for a couple of days now. The early days of this Persian Gulf War, and the airports were blanketed with security. They arbitrarily hauled off several hundred cars in the airport in Austin, Texas, because of you went in and you were stopped. If you were a blue-eyed wasp, forgive me for using that term, like me, with a very Anglo name, you passed right on through. But if you had anything resembling a Middle Eastern name, or looked like you might come from the Middle East, you were stopped and pulled politely to one side and questioned. Now, the interesting thing, this control in the airport, this conditioning the people to control, is that they interviewed lots of people, and everybody they interviewed was saying, oh, yeah, I buy it. We can't have this, I feel safer because of this crackdown. And each time, again, the brush passes over, we lose our freedoms, and apparently most of the people buy it and are accepting it and are being conditioned to accept something much less than democracy. Now, your position, yes, you stand up and call it like it is and express your concerns, and you're attacked. I certainly get this all the time. But it may give you some sense of shared energy and leadership. Francis Farenthold, Sissy Farenthold, one of the greatest leaders that I know in the U.S. progressive peace movement, a former Texas legislator, president of a college, now I believe is the chair of IPS in Washington, working with Ramsey Clark, talking to him about the impeachment proceedings against George Bush now for this war. Her stated objective for us, for the people of the United States who value and cherish democracy, is that we must repeal the National Security Act of 1947. We've got to rise up and say democracy is what counts in this country, not George Bush's New World Order controlled in the interests of a very small group of people who have the big bucks in the world, and get this country back in the direction of freedom and civil rights and the things it supposedly stands for or should stand for, and get it away from this national security, FEMA, and the taking away, the destruction of the Bill of Rights.
We've got one last call, John. Good morning, you're on KGNU. Thanks for waiting.
Hello.
Yes, you're on KGNU with John Stockwell.
Thank you, David. I'm just a little curious about the previous statement from John about the peace movement and its association or support of our troops in the Middle East. I carried a sign on Martin Luther King's birthday march in Denver on Monday, which said, "Support our troops, bring them home." I had mixed feelings about carrying that sign. I really didn't want to carry that sign. I carried it in the spirit of the march, but not in the spirit of what I was feeling in my heart. What has happened to the peace movement? Suddenly we are considered unpatriotic if we don't support the troops. How should the peace movement approach that topic? It's very difficult, and I feel like there's a whole lot of McCarthyism coming down on us, and for some reason we're being I'm sorry, I can't say the word. In cooperating with that kind of tone. I don't want to support troops who have a rush of testosterone to go kill third world peoples at the commander-in-chief's wish. How do we address that?
I see George Bush as having succeeded in putting the peace community so much on the psychological defensive that it's this yellow armbands and yellow ribbons had a big demonstration in Austin. I thought about it, and refused to wear one. When I got up to speak, and I said, with all respect to everyone and no anger and hate at anyone, including troops over there, I'm not going to wear one of those ribbons because those are volunteer troops who joined the Army of their own volition and went over to do these violent things. And they all had a choice of not joining and not going, and they went, and they're killing now. I made the analogy between if you, for example, supposing you had a son. I'm in the age of grown children. Supposing your son had joined a gang and was into vandalism and maybe was killing people, you wouldn't stop loving the son, but you certainly would not approve of the activities. You would not support the son or daughter as they went to the gang meetings and participated in the violence. It wouldn't be enough to say, I support you, I love you, but don't do that. You have to take a firmer position and condemn what they're doing. I believe that the peace movement, now mind you, people in the audience, some of them at first were calling out at me. The first time in 13 years that I've given my 600-odd lectures and speeches, that people in the audience were yelling disapproval with what I was saying. By the time I finished, they had stopped. But some people were saying, for example, they didn't want to fight, they wanted a scholarship. Well, I'm sorry, but that's mercenary stuff. If you go into the military in order to get the money, you've become a mercenary, and you've lost, I believe, the option of later saying, well, I didn't really want to fight, I just wanted a scholarship. There are other ways to get money in a scholarship. I think we have to be people in the peace community yearning for peace, yearning to feel good about something as horrible as war, not wanting to get into the feelings of anger and blame and fault. Now, mind you, in the first days and months, even years of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of support, kind of like what's happening here, which faded as the war was not successful. I think if this thing goes on for 3 years or 5 years, of course, it will become fiercely unpopular. But it's a sad commentary that a lot of people who are basically anti-war will nevertheless see the pageantry of bombing and strafing and rockets and support it. And then again, shy away from a firmer position of about what's being done and say, well, we don't want to blame the men and women on the ground there. We don't want to be angry with them. And I don't know, if you're Christian, you might go back to the Bible where Jesus took on the money changers and showed anger and said there's a time when you have to be angry and stand up to what's happening.
John, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We'd really like to thank you for your generosity this Wednesday morning. I know you're absolutely, totally busy with lots of interviews. Thanks so much, and to you and to all our KGNU listeners for calling, and for those of you who couldn't get through to John Stockwell, thanks, and we hope to have you back on again very soon.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. That was former CIA case officer John Stockwell. He served in the Congo, in Vietnam, and he was director of the secret war in Angola. This is KGNU in Boulder. It's a minute past the hour of 9 o'clock. You've been listening to special KGNU coverage of the Gulf War. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you.